We've all heard the term inflation thrown around a million times, but very few people actually know what it is. Have you ever wondered, how could inflation be going down if gas prices are up 50% over the past 2 weeks? Or how can inflation be going down if my bills are still going up? Well, by the end of this video, not only will you be able to answer those questions, but you'll know more than 99% of the people out there about inflation. Today, I'm going to teach you how it's calculated, what the differences are between key terms like core inflation and headline inflation, CPI and PCE, and much more, all in a way that makes it simple to understand. Let's dive in.
A new report shows U.S. inflation is continuing to cool.
The U.S. inflation rate takes a significant dip.
Shows U.S. inflation picked up.
Inflation may be continuing to ease right here in the U.S.
The most basic explanation of inflation is just a measure of how prices have changed over the past year. Inflation means prices have gone up, and deflation means they've gone down. But what prices are we talking about? We all buy lots of different things, right? And the prices of bread and rent and haircuts don't all change the same amount at the same time. So when you hear inflation is 5%, what does that really mean? Well, since we all buy different things and their prices don't move the same way, inflation is designed to measure the price increases of a basket of goods that represents a typical person's spending. Think about your monthly bills. If you were to divide them up by category, you might find that you spend 20% on rent, 5% on groceries, 3% on gas, and so forth and so on. Inflation statistics attempt to represent how prices are changing for your overall spending as closely as possible. Let's start with CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index. That makes sense, right? It's focused on consumers like you and measures the prices they pay for an index of goods and services. CPI is the most common measure of inflation, and 99% of the time when you hear inflation, that's what it's referring to. They actually measure over 200 different prices across the country, but they can be broken down into these 8 categories. The biggest one is housing, which makes up 44% of the index, because that's the biggest portion of most people's monthly expenses. And that's not just rent either. It's hotels, electricity, furniture, tools, and just about everything else you can think of related to housing. Transportation includes things like gas, plane tickets, new and used cars, and registration fees. Food and beverages is made up of a huge list of things people buy, from different types of groceries to restaurant meals to alcohol. My favorite is snacks, snacky snacks. 0.4% of overall expenses. For me, it feels more like 80%, but I haven't counted. If you're curious to see all the little components they measure, you can find it by searching for CPI relative importance. So that's headline inflation. But sometimes you'll hear people refer to core inflation instead, which is simply the headline inflation, but with food and energy taken out. The reason food and energy are not included in core inflation is because they're so volatile that they can swing the overall inflation number around a lot. Sure, that makes great headlines, haha, get it? But in reality, big moves in food and energy prices are often driven by things like bad weather, wars, or other temporary factors that eventually reverse course. Core inflation gives people a way to see what the more reliable and repeatable parts of inflation are doing in order to get a clearer picture of what's really going on. You can see from this chart where headline inflation is blue and core inflation is in red, how food and energy prices can swing the headline inflation number around pretty wildly. In 2020, when oil prices went negative at one point, that dropped headline inflation down close to 0%. But core inflation was still around 1.5%. Then in 2022, when a big oil and gas producer, Russia, invaded a big grain and fertilizer producer, Ukraine, food and energy prices spiked. I'm sure you saw all kinds of headlines about inflation around 9% last summer. But while core inflation was up, it really wasn't up that much. Core inflation was only in the 6 to 6.5% range. Fast forward to summer of 2023, and it was the opposite. Inflation had fallen almost back to 3% because oil prices had fallen from about $120 a barrel to more like $70. But the reality was, oil prices were not always going to fall by 50% every year, and core CPI had fallen, but not as much. So I think you've learned enough to answer our 2 opening questions. How can inflation be falling if gas prices have been rising over the past few weeks? Well, 2 reasons. First, you now know that inflation measures what's happened over the past year, not the past 2 weeks, right? And second, we know that there are over 200 components of inflation. So looking at just one of them doesn't tell you very much, especially when it's one of the most volatile ones. Our second question, how can inflation be going down if my bills are still going up, is answered by our basic definition of inflation. Any inflation means prices have been going up. If inflation is falling, it means that they're not going up as fast as they were before. It does not mean that prices are falling. That will be deflation, and it will be an economic disaster. Now look, I don't want to get too far off topic here, but people sometimes ask me, I hate these high prices. Wouldn't it be great if they come down? No, it really wouldn't. I'm filming this in late October, so it's a good time for this example. Are you going out of your way to do a lot of holiday shopping right now? My guess is no, because prices will probably go down around Black Friday in November. And that's smart of you. But what if people thought prices were always about to go down? Well, then they never buy anything unless they absolutely had to. Consumers would stop spending money, companies would stop investing in future growth, and the economy would grind to a halt. That's why most central banks, like the US Federal Reserve, try to manage interest rates to keep inflation low, but positive at around 2%. That's what's healthiest for an economy in the long run. And since we're on the topic of the Fed, I guess now would be a good time to distinguish between CPI and PCE. Headlines almost always show CPI, but when the Fed is setting monetary policy, like whether they should raise or lower interest rates, they are looking at the PCE, personal consumption expenditures. There are two key differences between PCE and CPI. The first one is that PCE adjusts the makeup of the basket more frequently to adapt to people's changing spending habits. For example, if all of a sudden there was a new 50% tax on all restaurant meals, they'd get a lot more expensive. So there would be a lot of inflation in that area. But people would also probably eat at restaurants a lot less often. So that would end up becoming a smaller part of the calculation, while groceries might get bigger. CPI also adjusts, but not as often. The second key difference between PCE and CPI is that PCE covers a wider range of spending. CPI only focuses on things people pay for themselves, but PCE also considers the prices of things that others buy for them. An example would be when drug prices go up, but the price that you pay stays the same because the insurance covers the cost of your prescription. CPI also only looks at urban households, while PCE considers urban and rural households. This wider coverage in PCE results in three key areas that drive the major differences in CPI and PCE at any given time. Healthcare is a much bigger portion of PCE than CPI, since so many of our healthcare costs in the US are paid for by the government or insurance companies. PCE counts that, but CPI doesn't. On the other side, energy and housing, especially housing, are much bigger components of CPI than PCE. So which one is better? I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that, but here's how I think of it. PCE is better for the Fed because they're in charge of the overall economy. So its broader nature and faster adjustments are more applicable to them. Specifically, they'll usually use core PCE, which takes out the food and energy, just like with CPI. And for regular people like you and me, CPI is probably better because it focuses only on the money that's actually coming out of our pockets. Let me say something. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You now know more about inflation than 99% of people out there. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to address them. And make sure to hit that subscribe button because in my next video, I'll be diving deeper into the main drivers of inflation to predict where it's headed in 2024. And if we know where inflation is headed, we have a better idea of where interest rates are headed and what investments might do well in that environment. I'm gonna make you smarter so you can make more money. And hey, last thing, if you want to talk to me directly, join my free Discord by clicking the link below in the description. Thanks for watching.